My parents gave me a book called How to Grow Up for my 30th birthday, thinking it was hilarious. 3 weeks later, my mom was crying in my kitchen, begging me to go back to how things were. When I showed them what the book had actually taught me, everything changed, and I finally understood why they'd kept me small for so long. The book was supposed to be a joke, a passive-aggressive birthday gift wrapped in cheerful yellow paper with little cartoon balloons, complete with a card that read, "Since you're still figuring it out, love Mom and Dad XXO." They thought it was absolutely hilarious. My dad, Richard, actually took a photo of me holding it at the kitchen table in their house on Maple Grove Avenue, probably planning to show it at every family barbecue and holiday gathering for the next decade. How to Grow Up, a guide for adults who feel like they're still faking it, by Dr. Sarah Chen. The cover was this soft mint green with simple white text, and there was a small illustration of a confused-looking stick figure wearing a business suit but holding a teddy bear. Professional, yet childish. Kind of like how my parents saw me, I guess. I'd been living in their finished basement in Willowbrook for 8 months at that point. Not because I couldn't afford my own place. I had a decent job as a graphic designer at Morrison Creative downtown, pulling in about $48,000 a year, which wasn't amazing, but was enough for a studio apartment in the suburbs. But every time I mentioned moving out, browsed rental listings on my laptop, or even talked about looking at apartments, my mom, Linda, would get this look. You know the one. The look that starts with slightly raised eyebrows, then transitions into this wounded expression, like you just told her you were planning to burn down the family photos. The look that says, "You're being selfish and ungrateful, and don't you remember everything we've done for you? Don't you remember how hard it was when you graduated college and couldn't find work for 6 months? Don't you remember how we took you back in without question when you broke up with Marcus and couldn't afford the apartment you'd been sharing?" So I stayed, paying them $400 a month in rent, which they claimed was just to help with utilities, but I knew was really about maintaining some illusion that this was a temporary business arrangement, rather than their 30-year-old daughter living in their basement like some kind of failure to launch. I was still eating dinner at their table every night at exactly 6:30 p.m., still having my mom do my laundry because the machines are right there in the basement anyway, honey, and I'm doing a load of darks. Still being asked if I'd remembered to take my vitamins and whether I was getting enough sleep and if I'd heard back from that boy from church, David Henley, who was such a nice young man and still single, you know? Still being treated like I was 17 instead of 30. The basement wasn't terrible, I'll give them that. They'd finished it nicely when I was in high school. Carpeted floors and this neutral beige, white walls, decent lighting. There was a small bathroom down there and what they generously called a kitchenette, which was really just a mini fridge, a microwave, and a coffee maker on a folding table. My bed was a queen-size mattress on a metal frame pushed against the far wall, with a mismatched dresser I'd bought at a garage sale, and a desk where I sometimes worked on freelance projects. It was fine. It was functional. It was also slowly suffocating me, but I'd gotten good at ignoring that feeling. The book sat on my nightstand for 2 weeks after the birthday dinner. Every time I looked at it, which was multiple times a day since it was literally right next to my bed, I felt this complicated mix of embarrassment, resentment, and curiosity. The embarrassment was obvious. My parents thought I needed a book on how to be an adult. The resentment was because, honestly, they weren't wrong, and that stung. But the curiosity was the strongest emotion, even though I didn't want to admit it. I'd pick it up sometimes, flip through the pages randomly, reading chapter titles like The Comfort Zone Trap and When Helping Becomes Enabling and Financial Boundaries More Than Just Money. Then I'd put it back down, feeling like reading it would be admitting defeat somehow. During those 2 weeks, life continued exactly as it had for months. I'd wake up around 7 a.m. to the sound of my parents moving around upstairs, my dad's heavy footsteps heading to the kitchen, the coffee maker gurgling to life, my mom's voice calling down the basement stairs, "Breakfast is ready if you want some, sweetheart." I'd usually decline, grab a granola bar and coffee, and head to work. Morrison Creative was a small agency in a converted warehouse downtown. My boss, Janet Morrison, was this intense woman in her 50s who wore exclusively black clothing and had opinions about everything. The work was mostly corporate brochures, website graphics, and the occasional logo design. It wasn't creative or fulfilling, but it was steady and I was good at it. My coworkers were nice enough. There was Tom, who was around my age and was always trying to get people to come to his band shows at dive bars I'd never heard of. Maria, who was a few years younger and was constantly talking about her weekend adventures and the guys she was dating through various apps. And David, not the church David my mom was always mentioning, who was in his 40s, married with kids, and treated me with this kind of gentle concern that made me feel both appreciated and pitied.
They all knew I lived with my parents. It had come up in casual conversation, and I'd learned to present it as a temporary thing, a smart financial decision, a way to save money. The housing market is crazy right now, I'd say. Or, I'm just stacking cash for a really good down payment. They'd nod understandingly, but I caught the looks sometimes. The subtle exchanges between Maria and Tom when they thought I wasn't paying attention. After work, I'd drive back to Willowbrook, about a 20-minute commute through suburban streets lined with modest two-story houses and small front yards. My parents' house was a pale blue colonial with white trim, built sometime in the 1980s. There was a small front porch where my mom kept potted plants that she tended to obsessively, and a driveway that my dad resurfaced every few years whether it needed it or not. Dinner was always waiting. My mom, Linda, was one of those people who expressed love through food and took any rejection of her cooking as a personal insult. She'd retired early from her job as a middle school secretary, and cooking elaborate dinners had become her primary hobby. We'd sit at the same kitchen table where I'd done homework as a kid, under the same brass chandelier with the fake candle bulbs, eating pot roast or chicken casserole or whatever she'd spent the afternoon preparing. My dad would talk about his day managing the customer service department at a small insurance company. My mom would update us on neighborhood gossip, who was getting divorced, who had health problems, whose kids were succeeding or failing at various life milestones. I'd contribute when asked direct questions, but mostly just listened, feeling like I was watching my life happen to someone else. After dinner, they'd settle into their recliners in the living room to watch their shows. My dad loved anything with explosions or car chases. My mom preferred crime dramas, the kind where attractive detectives solve murders in exactly 42 minutes. The volume was always turned up too loud because they both refused to admit their hearing wasn't what it used to be. I'd usually retreat to the basement, claiming I had work to do or was tired. Sometimes I actually did have freelance projects, small jobs I picked up online, designing flyers for local businesses or creating graphics for people's social media. But mostly I'd just lie on my bed with my laptop, scrolling through social media and feeling vaguely depressed about everyone else's seemingly more exciting lives. That's what I was doing on the Tuesday night when I finally opened the book. My parents were upstairs watching their crime shows, the volume cranked up so high I could hear every dramatic musical sting and tense conversation through the floor. The sound of fictional detectives solving fictional problems while I lay in a basement avoiding my real ones. I picked up How to Grow Up for probably the 15th time, but instead of just flipping through it, I actually started reading from the beginning. The introduction was written in this warm, conversational tone that immediately made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. Dr. Sarah Chen wrote about adults who felt like they were performing adulthood rather than actually living it. People who had the external markers of grown-up life but felt fundamentally unprepared for the emotional and psychological realities of independence. Many of my clients describe feeling like imposters in their own lives. They're capable, intelligent people who somehow never learned the internal skills that make adult life feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Often, this isn't their fault. It's the result of well-meaning families who protected them from failure, discomfort, and natural consequences, inadvertently preventing them from developing crucial life skills. I felt a little chill when I read that. It was too accurate, too specific to my exact situation. Chapter 1 was titled, Recognizing When Others Benefit from Your Immaturity. I almost closed the book right then. The title felt like an accusation, like Dr. Chen was somehow watching my life and calling me out. But something about the way she'd written the introduction, with compassion rather than judgment, made me keep reading. And what I found in those first few pages wasn't what I expected at all. Dr. Chen wasn't talking about immaturity in the way my parents always did, like it was a character flaw or a choice I was making to be difficult. She was talking about it as a system, a dynamic that required participation from multiple people. She wrote about families where keeping an adult child dependent served emotional needs for the parents, about how some people unconsciously sabotage their children's independence because it threatens their own sense of purpose and identity. The parent who insists on doing their adult child's laundry isn't just being helpful. They're maintaining a dynamic where they feel needed and their child feels incapable. The parent who reacts with hurt feelings every time their adult child makes an independent decision isn't just being sensitive, they're using emotional manipulation to maintain control. I had to put the book down for a minute. My heart was beating faster, and I felt this weird combination of relief and panic. Relief because someone was finally putting words to things I'd felt but couldn't articulate. Panic because those words were forcing me to look at my family differently than I ever had before. I picked up the book again and kept reading. Dr. Chen described something she called learned helplessness in high-functioning adults, people who were perfectly capable of managing their own lives but had been conditioned to believe they needed constant support and guidance. She talked about parents who created crises to solve, who offered help before it was requested, who made independence seem dangerous or selfish.
These parents, she wrote, often genuinely believe they're being loving and supportive. They don't recognize that they're creating dependency. They see their adult child struggles and think, they need me, rather than, I need to step back so they can learn to handle this themselves. Every page felt like Dr. Chen had been taking notes on my life. She described the guilt cycles I knew so well, how every attempt at independence was met with hurt feelings, disappointment, and reminders of how much my parents had sacrificed for me. How every failure or difficulty became evidence that I wasn't ready to be on my own yet. She wrote about adult children who stayed in situations that didn't serve them because leaving felt like betrayal, who made life decisions based on their parents' emotions rather than their own needs, who had never learned to trust their own judgment because someone was always there to make decisions for them. I was 3 chapters in when I realized I was crying. Not dramatic, heaving sobs, but just tears running down my face as I read. It was like someone had finally turned on a light in a room I'd been stumbling around in the dark for years. All these feelings I'd had, the sense that something was wrong with our family dynamic, the frustration with my own inability to just move out and live my own life, the confusion about why I felt so young and unprepared despite being a capable adult in most contexts, suddenly had names and explanations. I stayed up until almost 2 a.m. reading, only stopping when I heard my dad get up to use the bathroom upstairs and realized how late it was. I bookmarked my place and put the book back on the nightstand, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, connecting dots I'd never connected before, seeing patterns I'd never recognized. The next few days were strange. I went to work, ate dinner with my parents, maintained all the normal routines, but everything felt different. I kept thinking about what Dr. Chen had written, kept noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Like how my mom always anticipated my needs before I could express them, then seemed hurt if I didn't appreciate the gesture. How my dad always had opinions about my decisions, what job to take, what car to buy, how to spend my money, and presented those opinions as facts rather than suggestions. How they both seemed most comfortable when I was struggling with something, when I needed their advice or support or intervention. I started paying attention to our conversations differently. When my mom asked about my day, was she genuinely interested or was she fishing for problems she could solve? When my dad offered to help with my car maintenance, was he being helpful or was he maintaining a dynamic where I stayed dependent on him? The book was changing how I saw everything, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that yet. But I kept reading, night after night, feeling like I was learning a new language for understanding my own life.
And with each chapter, I started to realize that the book my parents had given me as a joke might be the thing that finally helped me grow up for real. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd given me the exact tool I needed to understand why growing up had been so difficult in the first place. What I didn't know yet was that putting that understanding into practice would change everything, and that my parents weren't going to find it nearly as funny as they'd thought they would. The morning after I finished Chapter 3, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. It was Thursday, October 12th, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel that familiar dread about starting another identical day. Instead, I felt curious, like I was conducting an experiment on my own life. I decided to test something small. Instead of my usual routine of grabbing a granola bar and coffee before work, I stayed upstairs for breakfast. My mom, Linda, was already at the stove making scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. The kitchen smelled like butter and coffee, and morning sunlight streamed through the white curtains she'd hung over the sink. "Oh," she said, turning with a bright smile when she saw me. "You're up early, sweetheart. Perfect timing. I made plenty of eggs." Here was the thing I'd never noticed before. She'd been making this elaborate morning meal for an audience of one, hoping I'd join her. I sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table with 6 chairs even though only 3 people lived here, and accepted the plate she enthusiastically prepared for me. Everything was perfectly arranged. Eggs fluffy and seasoned just right, bacon crispy but not burned, toast cut diagonally the way I'd liked it as a kid. "This is really good, Mom," I said, and her face lit up like I'd told her she'd won the lottery. "I'm so glad you're eating a real breakfast," she said, settling into the chair across from me with her own plate. "You can't live on those granola bars forever. Your body needs protein in the morning, especially with how hard you work." I worked as a graphic designer at a small agency. I sat at a computer for 8 hours a day. It wasn't exactly manual labor, but my mom had this way of making everything I did sound both incredibly important and slightly precarious, like I was one missed meal away from collapse. As I ate, she chatted about her plans for the day. She was going to grocery shop, then stop by my Aunt Carol's house to check on her. Carol had broken her ankle 3 weeks ago and was milking it for all it was worth. Then maybe do some gardening if the weather held up. She'd retired from her job as a secretary at Willowbrook Middle School 2 years ago, and her days had this carefully structured quality, like she was trying to prove to herself that retirement was just as important and busy as working had been. "What about you?" she asked. "Any interesting projects at work today?" I told her about the logo redesign I was working on for a local veterinary clinic, and she listened with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for state secrets. She asked follow-up questions, offered suggestions about color schemes — she had no background in design — and worried aloud about whether my boss Janet appreciated how talented I was. "You know," she said, getting up to refill my coffee cup without being asked, "you could probably start your own design business. You're so creative and you have such good ideas. You could work from home, set your own hours. I could help with the administrative stuff. I'm good with organizing and scheduling." This was a conversation we'd had at least a dozen times over the past year. My mom loved the idea of me working from home, loved the vision of us collaborating on something together. She'd paint this picture of me as this successful entrepreneur, with her as my trusted business partner, both of us working from the house, taking breaks to have lunch together, maybe even traveling to meet clients. It always sounded suffocating to me, but I'd never been able to articulate why without seeming ungrateful. This morning, armed with Dr. Chen's concepts, I could see it differently. This wasn't about my career success. This was about my mom needing a purpose now that her primary job, raising me, was supposed to be finished. "Maybe someday," I said, which was my standard response. "I just think you have so much potential," she continued. "And you know your father and I would support you however we could, financially, I mean, while you're getting started. You wouldn't have to worry about rent or food or any of that." And there it was, the offer that sounded generous, but came with invisible strings attached. "Stay dependent on us, and we'll make sure you never have to face any real risks or challenges. Let us manage your life, and you'll never have to grow up completely. After breakfast, I drove to work through the familiar suburban streets of Willowbrook. The leaves were just starting to change colors, reds and yellows mixed in with the green, creating this postcard-perfect October scene. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, but today I found myself really looking at the neighborhoods I passed through. Most of the houses were similar to my parents', middle-class colonial and ranch-style homes with small front yards and attached garages. Some had been updated with modern landscaping or fresh paint, but others looked exactly the same as they had when I was a kid. There was something comforting about that consistency, but also something stagnant. Morrison Creative was located in a converted warehouse in what the city optimistically called the Arts District, though it really was just a handful of small businesses scattered among empty lots and auto repair shops. The building was red brick with big windows, and Janet had tried to make the interior feel creative and inspiring with exposed ductwork, colorful furniture, and motivational posters about thinking outside the box. My desk was in the main workspace, a large open area with 6 workstations separated by low dividers. Tom Peterson was already there when I arrived, hunched over his computer with enormous headphones on, working on an animation for a local restaurant's website. He was 28, tall and thin, with carefully messy brown hair and a beard that suggested he took his coffee seriously. "Morning, sunshine," he said, pulling off his headphones. "You look unusually chipper for a Thursday." "Do I?" I settled into my chair and started up my computer. "I had a good breakfast." "Ah, the power of a proper meal. Your mom's cooking again?" Tom knew about my living situation, but he was one of the few people who didn't seem to judge it. He still lived with 2 roommates in a cramped apartment downtown, so maybe he understood that housing was expensive and family arrangements were complicated. Maria Gonzalez arrived about 10 minutes later, looking slightly frazzled and carrying a large iced coffee that probably cost more than my lunch budget. She was 26, with dark hair that she wore in elaborate braids and an impressive collection of vintage band t-shirts. She had this energy that made everything feel more exciting than it actually was. "Sorry I'm late," she announced to the room. "My upstairs neighbor decided to practice drums at 6 a.m., so I basically didn't sleep. Also, I think I'm dating a sociopath." "Again?" Tom asked, not looking up at his screen. "Different sociopath. This one seemed really normal at first, which I'm starting to think is actually a red flag. Like, who's that well-adjusted at 29? It's suspicious." She settled at her desk, which was directly across from mine, and immediately launched into a detailed recap of her dating life. Maria approached relationships like they were extreme sports, high stakes, high drama, and always with the potential for spectacular crashes. She went on multiple dates per week, had elaborate theories about male psychology, and treated every romantic encounter like it was material for a future memoir.
Listening to her stories always made me feel like I was from a different planet. While she was navigating the complexities of modern dating apps and casual hookups, I was eating dinner with my parents every night and being asked if I'd heard from David Henley, the nice boy from church who was still single. The irony wasn't lost on me that Maria, who was 4 years younger, seemed infinitely more adult than I felt. She had her own apartment, paid her own bills, made her own decisions about everything from what to eat for breakfast to whom to sleep with. She complained about her life constantly, but she was living it on her own terms. Janet Morrison arrived around 9:30, which was normal for her. She was the kind of boss who cared more about results than punctuality, probably because she wasn't much of a morning person herself. She was in her early 50s, with short gray hair that she kept in a practical cut, and a wardrobe that consisted entirely of black clothing in different textures and styles. "Morning, team," she said, stopping by my desk. "How's the veterinary logo coming along?" I showed her the 3 concepts I'd been working on. One that played with paw prints, one that incorporated a stylized stethoscope, and one that was more abstract but somehow still suggested both caring and professionalism. "These are solid," she said, studying my screen. "I like the abstract one. It's sophisticated without being cold.
What do you think about adding just a touch of warmth to the color palette? This was why I liked working for Janet. She had opinions and creative instincts, but she trusted my expertise and didn't micromanage me. She treated me like a professional, which was a novelty in my life. The rest of the morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of work. I refined the logo design, responded to emails, and started preliminary sketches for a brochure layout. It was the kind of focused, productive time that made me feel competent and useful. Around noon, Maria suggested we grab lunch at the sandwich shop down the street. It was something we did maybe once a week, a chance to get out of the office and catch up on non-work topics. Tom usually joined us, and sometimes David Chen, the married coworker, not the church David, depending on his schedule. The sandwich shop was called The Daily Grind, which was a terrible name, but the food was good and the prices were reasonable. We found a table by the window, and Maria immediately launched into another dating story, while Tom and I listened with a mixture of entertainment and exhaustion. So this guy texts me at midnight asking if I want to hang out, she said, making air quotes. And I'm like, at least pretend you want to have a conversation first, you know? Whatever happened to courtship, to romance, to acting like women are human beings instead of delivery services? Maybe you're using the wrong apps, Tom suggested. There are some that are supposed to be more relationship-focused. I've tried them all, trust me. The problem isn't the platform, it's that dating culture is fundamentally broken. Everyone wants all the benefits of a relationship without any of the emotional investment. I found myself thinking about this conversation later as I drove home from work. Maria's dating life seemed chaotic and frequently disappointing, but at least she was out there, trying. She was putting herself in situations where she could meet people, experience attraction, deal with rejection, figure out what she wanted. She was learning about herself through trial and error, making mistakes and recovering from them. Meanwhile, I was living in my parents' basement, being periodically asked about David Henley from church. When had I stopped building my own life? When had I started accepting this weird suspended animation where I was 30 years old but still living like I was waiting for my real life to begin? As I pulled into the driveway on Maple Grove Avenue, I saw my mom through the kitchen window already starting dinner preparations. The sight that had always felt comforting, the promise of a home-cooked meal and family time, suddenly felt different. It felt like a trap I'd built for myself, one comfortable routine at a time.